Everyone again, and happy Tuesday. And thank you very, very much for being with us today to participate in this Environment Committee meeting. We have a star-studded speakers lineup today, and I'm going to do something rare. I'm going to turn this all over to my colleague and friend Edith Macra to walk us through, to introduce us to our speakers, and I'm going to participate quietly from the side. So again, thank you all very, very much for being with us. This is an important discussion. I know that the topic hits home for many of us, and I believe we have some information to share that's going to be not only pertinent, but of course timely. So with that, Edith, thank you very much.
Thank you everyone for being here. A great turnout today. If you hadn't seen on social media or otherwise heard, we wanted to share some very, very good news. And that is that our project is called the Chicago Regional Climate Action Planning Partnership, which is the collaboration that produced the climate plan for the Chicago region. We were awarded the Climate Leadership Award in the Innovative Partnership category. And the awarding agency, it's a national big deal award, is C2ES, which stands for Climate and Energy Solutions, and the Climate Registry. We share this national recognition with the likes of Microsoft, Bank of America, and the U.S. Climate Alliance, which is the Association of Governors for Climate, which includes Governor Pritzker. So C2ES mostly focuses on corporate sustainability, and we are awarded one of the fewer not-for-profit local government awards. So the award notably was given to the partnership we formed for creating the CAP. Because we applied for the award last November before the CAP was complete. And of course, our partnership, a key partner is NOAA. Other partners include the University of Illinois, Argonne National Laboratories, CMAP, and of course, all of our Greenest Region Compact communities are named in the award. So congratulations to all of you that contributed to the development of the CAP. So if you would give yourself a little applause. Thank you so much for all the partnership work there. Our most valued partner is my co-author, Dr. Ned Gardiner. And Ned is joining us today to help us move from the focus of the Regional Climate Action Plan to begin to strengthen resilience at the local level. Most of you that participated in the CAP development will know that Ned is the engagement manager of the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit. He works for the NOAA Climate Program Office as a contractor through CollaboraLink Technologies. Ned led us in June of 2020, right when we were getting used to online life. He led us in a series of 4 workshops online to discuss regional climate risks and vulnerabilities and to formulate strategies that would help municipalities adapt to climate change. It was these important conversations that allowed us to craft the climate adaptation portion of the CAP. From those conversations and the climate risk and vulnerability assessment, we learned that flooding and extreme heat are the greatest threats across the region, and drought follows closely behind. We know that not every community will experience the same impacts of these hazards. It depends on unique community scale vulnerabilities. The next step, as Ned has told us all along, is for every community to take the steps to resilience to develop their own local priorities. We have a shining example in Geneva. They have taken some steps through a citywide drainage study. The Department of Public Works Director Rich Babica and consultant Greg Chismark, who's the president of WBK Engineering, will describe how this project was done, the impetus behind it, and I think some really unique public engagement and analysis that was done. So with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Dr. Ned Gardiner.
Thank you, Edith, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm still seeing you on screen, just FYI, Cheryl. After I show my face, I'll share my screen and get into a few slides.
Ned, you are being spotlighted, FYI.
Okay, I'm seeing Edith's picture, just FYI for everybody else. And it's good to see some familiar faces and names and to be in a sustained conversation with this community. It's been, for me personally, very gratifying to be working with people who are motivated and engaged on the issue of climate change mitigation and adaptation. We know we have to do both together. And not all communities in the United States are as eager and forward-looking as the communities surrounding Chicago. So I applaud you, and I welcome the opportunity to continue working together, because we must, in fact, do this work in order to meet the challenges that our generation faces. And they are summarized in this illustration, which you'll find in the Climate Action Plan, which actually encompasses many different topics here. We are focused on the Great Lakes region and northeastern Illinois in particular, but we're part of a planetary system. And as an Earth systems scientist, for me, that's just part of my outlook and my framing and my understanding of everything in my life, but I know it is not necessarily your orientation to the way you see the world. So for me, visualization of the planetary system is important in recognizing our place. These CO2 clouds here that appear in the image represent the unintended consequences of the industrial activity that made life great for us as a generation, and our progenitors were able to arise from a nation that was really grinding along through the very difficult challenge of finding our place on the planet and in the global economy. But greenhouse gas emissions come from the release of not just the energy stored on the planet, but our own collective industrial activity, which has, I like to point out, opened up many possibilities that have made life better. And I sincerely am grateful to live at a time when we don't have to think about the struggle for food and survival every day, but it is our responsibility now to cap these emissions, reduce them to zero, so that the planetary load of greenhouse gases can level off or decrease over time. That is essential for the survival of not just our species. If you want to just focus on our species, fine, but for the planetary system. And the way we're going to get there is this year, get into high gear and shift our economic systems towards renewable energy and sustainable communities through equitable adaptation and mitigation of greenhouse gases. Why do we need to do that? Well, we know that the risk due to climate change is one that is increasingly putting our industrial activity, economy, and livelihoods in jeopardy. Just looking back to the time when I was in high school and junior high school, the amount of money we spend as a nation on responding to and recovering from climate-driven hazards was a very small fraction of what it is routinely today. And this risk is increasing through time. In today's presentation, we're going to be looking at the climate and non-climate factors that lead to that increasing risk. But we know that climate plays a role in dealing harder and harder punches. So we must begin to catch up with the increasing risk of climate-related hazards by enacting local resilience activities that help us to respond and maintain our infrastructure and our livelihoods. So the way we're going to do that is greatly accelerate resilience activity. As Edith mentioned, we are going to feature an activity that is going on in Geneva as we speak, but the idea of this case study is to suggest that it is one among many activities we need to scale up and accelerate in order to meet the challenge of increasing risk to our economy and livelihoods from climate-related hazards. And the way we're going to do that is through focusing on our families and our communities. working with municipalities in a regional context and the state, channeling even federal resources to bring to bear on local problems, and vice versa. Federal partners understanding more and more how to channel resources down to where they're needed the most. So for example, I'm working with the FEMA to understand Region 5 around the Great Lakes, how we can better coordinate our risk assessment process, the steps to resilience, which we're going to talk about in a moment, so that FEMA can do its job better. So I welcome questions about that. But what does building resilience then look like? So if today we have a society in which we routinely experience the impacts of flooding that jeopardizes our ability to get to work, get to school, get to church, and so forth, what we want to see tomorrow is an infrastructure and set of systems put in place that is resilient to the flooding, that can accommodate the overland flow of water, and have an economic system that also supports not increasing the impact of those problems over time. So it's probably worth reviewing, what does resilience mean? I like to think of it in this conceptual way about some capacity in the system, the quality of life system. For many of you, this is going to be review. So I'm going to move through this quickly, and I will encourage anyone to ask questions at any time if I'm going too quickly. But if we think about getting to work, for example, as something we need to do to maintain quality of life, and most days we can get to work and we know how long it takes and so forth. Well, during an acute hazard like the extreme rainfall that we experienced last spring, we may be disrupted in our daily life, but after even a few days, roads come back to normal and we get complete recovery. But in a non-resilient system, an acute hazard may take us over a tipping point. New Orleans comes to mind, where society just doesn't rebound, and that's the kind of situation that leads to a permanent loss, and we want to avoid that. The way we do that is increase capacity in the system so that after an acute hazard, we can recover completely instead of having a lower quality of life permanently after an extreme event. So a resilient system has this capacity built in and can recover completely. Non-climate stressors are an important part of understanding resilience, because this is where we typically can make an impact, where we can, in fact, address the problem. And I want to emphasize that when I'm talking about resilience, I'm not talking about just dealing with problems or just withstanding problems. I'm talking about increasing capacity and improving quality of life, improving conditions for everybody. We know for the region as a whole that population growth, that perhaps not for every community, but in the region, that there are racial and economic disparities, and that revenue for government is a persistent problem that a lot of you are facing and having to deal with, but that aging infrastructure, aging population, and sprawl and a decrease in open space make dealing with climate resilience a bigger challenge. These ideas, I should give credit where it's due, are very well articulated in the master plan that CMAP produced for the Chicago region. So it's a long-term known set of non-climate stressors. So the plan and the steps to resilience that I'm talking about with you today need to take you through the process of prioritization so that you can put funding in place to, in fact, address the challenges that you have in your own communities so that you can build capacity and enhance services. So the steps to resilience, and I've got to say this little page number thing is really annoying me here on these pages. I don't know where this came in. Sorry. Just I don't know that this is going to go away if I just delete that, but I never, there are little numbers showing up on the screen. If you see those come back, please just ignore them. This graphic summarizes what the whole steps to resilience framework is about. It's 5 steps, which whether you're in transportation or housing or food systems or health, really any sector, your workflow for how you plan and implement projects that you develop for your local municipalities and communities may not look like this with these names. But if you're doing a climate resilience set of steps within your whatever frame you're situated, this provides you a checklist of things that you can check off and make sure you're addressing. The idea is to understand the impacts to people and resources where you live, not only what has happened, but what's likely to happen or that you're concerned might happen in the future. Then evaluate vulnerability and risk. And if there are unacceptable risks, you need to develop options and prioritize what to do, but since you don't have unlimited budgets, and then take action. And this is an iterative process that involves engagement and working with communities, centering in equity so that everyone in your community is involved. So the steps to resilience framework, in short, is incorporating climate risk into the kinds of decisions that you make already every day. But it's an essential part of the climate action plan that we developed together. So let's see, we've been through this. Oh, sorry, I'm going the wrong direction with my arrow. So in the first step, where we explore hazards, we're really looking at the potential impacts of a hazard. And so climate can influence hazards, and hazards affect things that we care about. For example, heat. So our Climate Explorer tool provides you insight into what climate models and projections suggest could be serious problems for, say, the city of Geneva. And this is showing historically that the number of days over 95 in a given year was typically pretty low. A year with 5 or 10 days was an abnormality. But what the modeling shows is that the likelihood of not only 5 or 10 days, but perhaps as many as 2 or 3 months with days over 95 degrees is not at all out of the question. So for people who live in the upper Midwest, that's going to be quite a different way of life. This is an image taken over Geneva around, I believe this is around the year I was, well, a little before I was born. And you can see the rural characteristic of this landscape. And then fast forwarding to a more recent image, you could see the influence of exurbanization, but changing land use, but still with the preservation of some rural characteristics. And this brings a different set of considerations to people who, say, manage stormwater. So I want to keep in mind that while the climate is changing, so are non-climate factors, population growth, the demand for housing, the demand for commercial space, and so forth, which changes the risk, both of which change the risk profile in a place. Now, the good news is we have some really skilled people in Geneva who are considering the changing climate and the changing landscape as they put together stormwater management plans. And with that, I'd like to invite to the stage Greg Chismark and Rich Babica. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to folks in Geneva to jump in and present some of the work that they've been doing to prepare for stormwater management concerns. Of course, if folks have questions, this is a good time to throw them my way while we're making a transition.
Feel free to unmute yourself and just go ahead and ask the question if you would like, or you can use the chat function.
Okay, not seeing any questions, I'll hand it over to Rich and Greg, and you all can take it away when you're ready.
Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Richard Babica. I'm the Director of Public Works for the City of Geneva. We had a little bit of technical issues there, so we lost sound, so we're actually coming in through our phone. As Greg brings up the presentation, a little background to how means and methods of why we wound up here. The City of Geneva undertook a holistic drainage review of the entire city. We wanted to document and investigate how the city's drainage system works. The City of Geneva dates back to the pre-Civil War, and we're along the banks of the Fox River. We're in 2 watersheds, and we have a mixture of very old infrastructure and brand new infrastructure, and we have some concerns as to how everything was interacting with each other. We're coming up on the end of about an 18-month study, and the process started with a series of public engagements. We wanted to get input from the community for both a historical analysis and as well as to reflect what both new residents have been experiencing and what some of the more established families in the community have experienced. We then took that historical data and combined that with the archives from both Public Works, Police, and Fire as they've dealt with drainage issues, and started to develop zones of concern. We started seeing clusters of drainage issues, and those warranted further investigation. We have spent a significant amount of the study going through those basins in those particular studies, and now we are in a process of developing a capital plan, both a 5-year and 10-year capital improvement plan. And then we will be presenting that to the City Council sometime in December. Not only did we look at the entire drainage basin of the city, but we also looked at the adjacent communities around us. So what flows were we getting from St. Charles, which is a community to the north, as well as what flows were we sending to Batavia, a community to the south, as well as how our drainage patterns were impacting the Fox River. The Fox River is the primary drinking supply for the city of Aurora, which is 2 communities to the south of us. So in addition to trying to identify drainage concerns, as well as reviewing our existing infrastructure, we wanted to ensure that we were not adversely impacting our neighbors. Finally, the final goal of this process was to kind of develop a historical archive and baseline for the future. The Public Works field itself is maturing at a rapid pace. A lot of us are going to be, over the next several years, have options, as we would refer to it. And we want to ensure that this baseline information is preserved for future use, because we're certainly not going to be able to fix everything within the timeline of our future career paths. So that is the means, methods, and or who's and whys of why we did this. And now I'm going to pass it off to Greg Chismark, President of WBK Engineering, who actually did the study for us. Greg?
Thank you, Rich. My name is Greg Chismark, WBK Engineering. It's our pleasure to collaborate with the City of Geneva, their staff, and be sharing with elected officials the study. Rich gave a brief overview of the study and what you're looking at here. Again, about an 18-month to 2-year process almost for us going through this. Bear in mind that we experienced the COVID pandemic as we began this process, which threw a wrinkle into the study. We are about 80%, I would say, complete with the study, targeted to be complete around the end of this year. Rich outlined the primary elements. Really begins with engaging the constituency in Geneva, finding out where they see and feel problems exist with the drainage system within the community. This is a comprehensive look. It's not just a focus on one area, but it's really citywide. Rich mentioned the deliverable, it being a capital plan, and it creates a baseline and a foundation upon which to build. And really the ultimate goal, I'm sure both Rich and I believe, is to improve decision-making and make sure that the best decisions are made with respect to resources within communities. Ned mentioned the limitations, many, if not all, municipalities face, and so our goal is to try and improve those decisions and provide information for those decision makers. So again, drainage overview with a map. Rich mentioned Geneva is on the eastern edge of Kane County, about in the middle north-south. And for those of you familiar with Route 38, sometimes referred to as Roosevelt Road for most of the Chicago region, goes right through the heart of Geneva as well as the Fox River on this graphic. Two primary watersheds, the Fox River, which is colored in a blue teal, and then the Mill Creek watershed on the western portion of the community is in the salmon color. Ultimately, Mill Creek drains back into the Fox River. There is a very small portion on the eastern edge of the community which drains east into Crest Creek and ultimately Des Plaines River. The community itself historically is defined by the Fox River through opportunities with the river, and there's a resurgence in economic activity around the river and the downtown. So the river has historically been a driver and a heart of the community and continues to be in the future, which is why we care so much about the river and the quality. And one last point is, as we got into the study and looked at some of the findings and why, we see two significant growth spurts, if you will, from the 1950s to the 60s. You could describe this post-World War II, and then from 1990 to 2000, and I'll touch on why that's important relative to what we found in a moment. So a couple quick overviews, a few quick takeaways. The study is not completed by any stretch, but a few things we are finding out is that Geneva does not have severe stormwater problems compared to other areas. And when I say that, I'm talking about building structure flooding. For sure, there is some homes who have had some pump failure, but generally speaking, there are not neighborhoods that go underwater when it rains hard. That's not to say there aren't drainage challenges, but the severity of the problems are not significant relative to structure damage within the community. Also, the Fox River, despite it being a major waterway, is not a significant area of concern for the community. It is the upland areas that drain to the Fox River that we see as being most challenging. And then the last bullet is that we find that although we find some challenges in the older parts of the community, some of the newer areas we're also seeing challenges. And again, I'll touch on why we think that may be occurring in the next few slides. So the study started, as Rich noted, with really public outreach and engagement, and there were several input mechanisms for the community. The first one being a web-based mapping platform, Social Pinpoint, and the graphic you see on the right is actually a screenshot from the draft study that mapped out where residents provided input throughout the community. Again, the watersheds are colored, but you can see from the map that it's widespread. It's not focused on any one area. It's not on the east side, not on the west side. It's not in the older parts around the river or on the newer parts away from the river. It's throughout the community. We also did hold an open house in October of 2020. We followed CDC guidelines in that open house, but received some good resident interaction at that time. The city has a work order system, and so on a regular basis prior to the study, The city received input from citizens. That functioned throughout the course of the study. And then whether it was a good thing or bad thing, we did have a fairly significant rainfall event around May 20th of 2020 that really brought out a number of residents and concerns relative to the study. So between all that input, we received about 250 interactions with residents in Geneva who either put a pin on the map, they showed up at an open house, or they called in and we responded to, the city staff responded to concerns from the May 20 rainfall event. So we believe we had a really good sense of what is going on in the community. We combined this with city staff knowledge, historic, of where flooding and drainage concerns were out throughout the community. So a very good opening to where the issues are. We ended up with 21 specific drainage concerns, and they're varied in terms of their type and size. We find some of them are very specific and maybe limited to 1 or 2 or 3 residential lots. Those are the magenta dots that you see on the map. They're very localized to a specific location within a neighborhood or a subdivision. There are some other areas where we see there is a cluster of concerns that are more systemic. They're related to the type of infrastructure or function of infrastructure or system which people are served by, the drainage system people are served by. Those are the larger blocks that you see. And those are typically more complex in terms of what, how do we provide the level of service that we want to provide to those residents. So a range of complexity, where necessary, hydrologic, hydraulic analyses were provided. We looked at alternatives, collaborated with city staff on what the most optimal alternatives were, and then developed budget estimates to roll into a capital plan for the city to utilize in the future. We then started to ask the question of why? Why are we seeing these drainage issues? What is causing us to see drainage concerns in, I'll call it, newer areas versus some of the older, mature neighborhoods within the community? And one of the reasons that I think ties in well with what Ned is speaking about is, as an engineer working in the industry, looking at rainfall data. And the engineers will use the published rainfall data, the best available data to us. So there's 3 data sources this graphic, the bar chart, indicates. Technical paper 40, TP40 was published in 1960. Bulletin 70 was roughly published in 1990. And Bulletin 75 is our current rainfall data we use, published in 2019, but effectively 2020. So keep those dates in mind, 1960, 1990, and 2020 as the rainfall dates. And this is the data the engineers used when designing the infrastructure for our communities. And what I'm displaying here is the 100-year, 24-hour event. And that 24-hour event, as we look at across the 3 data sources, had an increase from 1990 to 2020, or Bulletin 70 to Bulletin 75, about 13%, and from technical paper 40 to Bulletin 75, about 48%. The 10-year event is typically the event that storm sewer is sized for, and that also saw similar increases in the rainfall data, 15% increase from 1990 to 2020, and a 21% increase from technical paper 40, 1960 to 2020. So the infrastructure that was designed 5 or 20 or 30 years ago was certainly adequate, met the standard at the time, used the best available data. But if we were to evaluate that infrastructure now, we would find it to be undersized based on the current rainfall data. And so that begins to explain, certainly in terms of some of the older neighborhoods, why we're seeing challenges and what the result of those challenges are. We also began to look at the growth and development patterns in Geneva relative to when that rainfall data came into play. And what you see here is a census data information in Geneva, and again, really indicating a growth spurt between 1950 and 1960, as well as
Greg, I'm jumping in. I'm not seeing the slides change. That may be isolated to me, but I'm still seeing the drainage study areas.
I'm still seeing the drainage study areas as well.
Okay.
Do you want to stop share and try it again?
Yeah, let me try that again, Ned. Thank you. I know we were having some issues with the internet, but let me stop sharing and try it again.
Tell you what, I think your video has also frozen. So what I'm going to do, I have your slides. I'm going to put them on screen myself, and you can talk through them.
Great.
And so I'm going to do that. I'm going to share my screen. Please bear with us, everybody.
As soon as you did that, it looks like their video unfroze temporarily.
Okay.
That's okay, Ned. Thank you, Ned.
You're welcome. Yeah. So let's just quickly touch again on the rainfall data, because what this is showing is climate change and observed climate change. So I want to make sure this point gets across, is that four different design storms all are showing increases across the 3 dates you mentioned. So maybe that's enough on that one, but I want to be sure that point gets across.
Yeah, thank you, Ned. And so this slide here indicates the census data, as I mentioned, and the growth that the community experienced between 1990 and 2000, the additional residents that came in. And that was right at the time that the rainfall data was being published. But once it's published, it takes a period before it gets utilized in the design of the plans. The other significant policy aspect that came into play in 2000 is a countywide stormwater ordinance. And that ordinance really began to set the standard for the county in terms of increased rigor and awareness of drainage systems and the design of the drainage systems. So you can see there was a significant growth prior to the ordinance. Now, the city had a local drainage ordinance, but I think the focus and the rigor that went into the design of those, I'll call it resiliency, I think is a good word to use, was not as robust as what we currently experience today. And so these factors, we believe, began to tell us a story of why what we call newer, albeit maybe 15 or 20 years old, areas of the community still do have some drainage challenges, and why we're seeing them. Because the rainfall data was being updated, as well as the policy aspects and regulation was being updated shortly thereafter. Then next slide, please. So this is really a wrap up as to the study the city is undertaking, and the value to the community that I know Rich believes will be delivered is helping making the best decisions possible for the community, providing a capital plan so that the limited resources can be utilized in the best possible way, mitigating risk for in the community by providing a baseline so that we can judge trends. If we only know where we are now, can we judge, are we improving or not, to improve that resiliency and risk mitigation? And then from a drainage system perspective, looking at it from an asset management viewpoint and approach. The drainage systems aren't often looked at it from that standpoint, yet they provide service to the community, and climate change certainly has an impact on those, and taking an asset management approach is the best way to manage that system of infrastructure and service to the community. With that, Rich, I'll see if you have any closing remarks you'd like to make.
I think the critical aspect is what Greg had just touched upon there, is that historically communities have not spent as much rigor and intense review on their drainage system as they have the other classic infrastructures, though the water, the sanitary, or even in Geneva's case, electrical, because we're on an electric utility. It's something that was attended to whenever there was a crisis, whenever it became a hot topic with a certain neighborhood. It was a Band-Aid approach. It was, what is it going to take to resolve the situation and make it go away? And between the change of philosophy, I think, as the profession of public works becomes more professional and more concerned of the environment, we see ourselves as stewards. So we're the operations people. We are trying to work that into our day-to-day planning now and being more recognizable, the fact that it's not just getting the water to go downhill and into the river and make it someone else's problem. It's how are we going to be able to get it down there in a controlled manner, in a resourceful manner, and in a manner that is going to mitigate any groundwater contaminants before it gets into the watershed. So it's, from a professional perspective, it's a pleasant surprise to see that philosophy is changing within the profession. But at the same time, we have, with the blessing of the City Council, have undertaken this approach to really get a comprehensive view and a holistic view of how the city interacts and interfaces with the watersheds and with each other. So with that, I would like to thank Greg for coming out today. I'd like to thank the opportunity to present in front of you all today. And Ned, it's back to you.
And we can take questions at this point for Rich and Greg. So I'll invite people to unmute and ask questions.
I've got a quick comment more than a question. I just want to say I really appreciate that public works folks are getting involved and engineers are getting involved in resilience work and incorporating it in and being proactive about it. That, you know, we really need the partnership of the people doing that work in order to address this. So thank you.
Mavis Bates, please. I'd like to see the slide with the bars, the graph again. That was very powerful. We only saw it for a second.
Okay, I'll bring it right back.
This is quite a picture. Thank you. Could you explain this one more time since we missed it before?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Rich.
So, yeah, this is a graphical display of the change in rainfall. Oh.
My mistake.
Okay.
My mouse is very sensitive. Sorry, go ahead, Greg.
Sure. This is a graphical display of the rainfall data that engineers have used since 1960 to current day, I guess I'll call it. The yellow being between 1960. Let me maybe correct that. So 1960 to 1990. So, you know, anything designed in 1985 would have, the best available data would have been the yellow bar. Anything between 1990 and quite frankly 2020 would have been the blue bar. Today, Northeast Illinois is using the green bar, Bulletin 75, published by the Illinois State Water Survey. And you could see the change in the data and the increase in the data. And you know, it's again, if you look at the percentages we represented, just between from 1990 to the 2020 data, it's significant. It's greater than 10% in terms of the rainfall depths. So that's the data that we're using to design these drainage systems within our communities.
And as we have been evaluating our own infrastructure and our detention and retention facilities, we have been evaluating it all off the Bulletin 75 data. And the resultant capital projects that we've been developing, a number of them are to how to retrofit the existing infrastructure to reflect the Bulletin 75. So we're taking data from the 1960s and bringing it forward close to 60 years of fresh data. And as part of that review, we have also found some very interesting infrastructure conflicts, shall we say, where the actual transmission pipes are undersized, or we have several instances where you have a 42-inch structure tying and draining into an 18-inch structure. You don't need to be a civil engineer or have 30 years of operational experience to know that trying to drain a 42-inch pipe into an 18-inch pipe generally doesn't work well. So that's also explained a lot of historical concerns that some of the neighborhoods have expressed.
Thank you very much.
So
This-
if designing your infrastructure now to this Bulletin 75, do you think based on this trend that you've had over all these years that increases every year, that it would be, is it better even to design your infrastructure so it exceeds the requirements in Bulletin 75? I mean, it looks like there's always increasing amount of water or stormwater, I mean.
So it really begs the question, doesn't it? It says if this is the trend, what should we plan on? And one thing I want to point out, so in most engineering practices, there's a factor of safety or kind of buffer, if you will, that there's design criteria and then there's a fail-safe. Again, it speaks to the resiliency of the design aspects. And so there are aspects in the design ensuring that overflow routes, so when storm sewers fail, when systems don't work well, or look, we're basing it on rainfall data, specific rainfall event. That doesn't mean it can't rain more than that, right? And so we know from what we've seen is that if we get a larger event, what happens in the community? And the first job should be protect property, protect private property, ensure that there's overflow routes, and a factor of safety. We sometimes refer to it as freeboard, which allows us to kind of mitigate some of those impacts that could be a result of some of the data change.
And I think the key statement there that Greg just made is it's when the system fails. Pre-planning overflow routes, pre-planning alternative discharge points and how that water is going to get there. It's not a question of if the storm system is going to fail. It is going to fail. It can be something simple as a pile of leaves blocking an inlet, to a basketball pipe, to a collapse. It is going to fail. So we are now consciously building up that safety factor, and there are discussions in the professional journals as to whether or not you need to start designing for, instead of a 10-year event for your transmission system, but for a 20 or a 25-year transmission system. And it really comes down to a question, as Ned alluded to earlier, of what is the risk tolerance of the local agency. We can build a transmission system that'll accommodate a 100-year event. It'll be cost prohibitive, but it can be done. So that is a key question, and it's a key policy decision that the elected officials need to start on deciding and discussing also, is how big of a risk and how big of a cost to reinvest in the infrastructure are they willing to undertake?
Rich and Greg, if this is Edith, if I can pull one of the questions off the chat, this is from Marcella Bondi-Keenan, who's with Oak Park now. How is Geneva incorporating green stormwater infrastructure into its asset management approach?
As a non-home rule community, we are actively seeking grants and awards to help offset our operational costs. Some of those awards, such as the IEPA 319 grant program, has a significant green infrastructure component. One of the areas that we were looking at briefly on the map, you saw it, is the Geneva High School. The Geneva High School is what is referred to as a rural cross-section. So there's no defined curb and gutter. It has ditch lines or swales on either side of the roadway. And as we're looking at restoring or regrading those swales, one of the components we're looking at is that do we do bioinfiltration galleries or bioswales, where the ditches are not just turf lined, but maybe they have plants that are going to enhance the drainage capacity as well as trapping some of the sediments and heavy metals into the plant structures themselves and act as a pre-filter. As we have been looking at other infrastructure reconstruction, the City Council and its strategic plan has made one of the primary, I think it's it's in the top 10 goals of reducing the carbon footprint as well as being more proactive in the water quality discharge because of the Fox River. The Fox River is such a key component of the city's tourism that we are now actively looking at putting in storm interceptors, for example, which are giant baskets that would catch solids before it gets drained into the Fox River. But again, it comes down to a funding issue, and that is where the city has been looking at the potential, stormwater utility has been reviewed in the past, grants, funding, and that gets, again, back into the policy discussion, is that there are means and methods for the city's staff and the engineering to design these improvements, but someone has to pay for them. And that's when we look to Kevin and the rest of the city council to find those funding sources for us.
Any other questions? Greg and Rich, if I could ask one more question, could you just, maybe this will pivot to what Ned can address, but you talk about those bulletins, and can you tell me if there is much interaction that you have in how those bulletins are designed, how frequently they're updated, and that leads to a bigger question of what you might need from the state and the federal government.
Those are issued by the state.
Yeah, the bulletins are published by the Illinois State Water Survey, and it's basically, the collection of the data they have. I don't know that there's any interaction on local level with respect to those. The state, if the question is, can the state use support from the federal government? Perhaps. I don't know that I'm in a position to comment on that, though.
The federal government, NOAA in particular, has a product that they develop in a standardized way called NOAA Atlas 14. And essentially the state water, the Bulletin 75 from the state is essentially superseding that by updating the precipitation frequency, intensity, duration, frequency curves for your state. And so the state can in fact step in and provide information when the federal government does not update data frequently enough. So you have expertise in state that you can use and rely on. So this is best practice, what Geneva is doing by using the bulletin. At the same time, multiple states typically will get together and lobby to NOAA to update the Atlas 14 data in order to have federal data to supplement their own findings. But this really is a best practice of using local information. I think with that, I will jump back in here and present a bit more about the steps to resilience. And I want to give you both great thanks for your work. One thing that came up in our conversation is that you are typically updating your evaluations on a 5-year rotation. So if you do that and you have updated data on intensity, duration, frequency, precipitation, and or flooding, you will in fact keep a pace with the observed climate change. This question about anticipated change in the future is a risk tolerance question. We asked a year ago, we asked people from throughout the region what they were concerned about in terms of climate, and flooding rises to the top. Well, we'll get to that in a minute here. Actually, let me skip that one survey because we're a little short on time. Flooding rises to the top of the issues of concern for people, but it came up in passing a moment ago. But flooding is not the only climate-related hazard to be concerned about. And so Public Works dealing with flooding is one among many strategies that you might pursue. And so in order to evaluate your overall exposure, vulnerability, and risk to climate hazards, we recommend an all hazards and all assets inventory approach at a scale appropriate to the decisions you make. So we asked people in the region what climate impacts you were concerned about. And flooding definitely rises to the top. Heat, as Edith mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, but a lot of non-climate and non-weather related issues also came up because that's how people relate to resilience, is through health, through social systems and so forth. So I really appreciated that the Public Works, the study that we just learned about included a lot of public input about where the problems with flooding are. I think public input about what kinds of impacts you're concerned about is a really critical step in a hazard inventory. But at the same time, there are some physical science and social science methods you can use to identify what are the primary ones of concern. Through our process last year, though, Edith and I came up with a set of 6, in this case, potential impacts of climate-related hazards on resilience throughout the Chicago region. Flooding rises to the top. Heat, but air quality, as well as drought and water supply, also were concerns that people raised over and over. So we have put together in the plan, in the action plan, a set of strategies you can take to address these potential impacts. And you might do your own asset inventory, evaluation of hazards, and then enumeration of what are the potential impacts from the concurrence of hazards and assets. So that is what we mean by explore hazards in the steps to resilience. Once we know there are potential impacts from climate, we assess vulnerability and risk in the steps to resilience. So here's an example, not from your study area, but if a flood came through this street, we have 2 buildings side by side that have very different vulnerability, but the same exposure. So a 1 foot flood that came up to this cinder block, let's say, would have a very different impact on a house that's raised up than on a business that has equipment and electricity and perhaps food and other material at that 1 foot elevation. So we distinguish vulnerability in terms of both sensitivity and adaptive capacity. So Greg talked about ordinances that can get passed at certain times, and he specifically mentioned freeboard. So a flood elevation plus 1 foot would be a typical freeboard. If that elevation is determined to be different through time and ordinances are required to either raise the freeboard beyond the margin of safety of 1 foot, then you can get building patterns where a newer building will have less, will have greater adaptive capacity built into it than an older building. And here the sensitivity is also different because here we have a car parked, which can be moved, but here we have this business's livelihood really right there at ground level. So the sensitivity is higher for the potential impact of a flood. Combined, the adaptive capacity and the sensitivity is what yields an assessment of vulnerability. Then risk incorporates probability and the potential impact. So we asked, we did surveys to look at potential impact and probability, which is how we determine risk. And we have these 5 different climate-related hazards. So of least concern perhaps was drought. And you can see for a lot of communities, it's either considered of low probability or low impact. So this outer ring here for drought, and at least 5 or 8 communities, I can't both highlight that and circle my mouse. So I'm going to highlight these 3 squares for you where probability is high and or impact is considered high. So there are some communities where those where drought is enough of a concern to need to be addressed. Now that may not be the case where you live, which is why, as Edith said at the beginning, it's important to locally assess your own vulnerability and risk to potential impacts from climate-related hazards. Whereas most people in the entire region feel that flooding is something to address and be concerned about. And you know, as we just learned from Geneva, there perhaps they are prepared for and understand their exposure, vulnerability, and risk, and are adequately prepared for it. So that's what you want to do when you know you have a high vulnerability or risk category of potential impact. And we could go on through each of these examples. But in your own community, I recommend evaluating your own exposure, vulnerability, and risk. And once you know what are the highest vulnerability and risk concerns, then develop a set of options. Now, there's some good news when it comes to options in that you do have the Climate Action Plan, which lays out some options you can take. Now, we have categorized some of the cross-cutting across the board important objectives that no matter what you're addressing are important for specifically addressing the climate change component of your own preparedness. Engagement and education in the community is important not only for providing services, but also for establishing equity and trust throughout your community and an understanding of exposure, vulnerability, and risk to climate-related hazards. So I think across the board in our country, we don't have a good literacy and understanding of our own exposure, vulnerability, and risk. Education is an important part of addressing that. Incorporating equity, I think we can all understand and relate to the need to address the concerns of all citizens and to particularly address underserved populations and their needs. That requires trust building, that requires time and investment of effort and energy. Collaboration and building capacity is a process that might involve a lot of technical skill building, maybe providing more input to different departments in your city, municipal, what have you, government, local governments, training in emergency management, emergency planning, floodplain management, and land use planning. The integration of land use planning with, someone brought up the point of green infrastructure, making sure that floodplains are accommodating the flow of water during flood events, and that there aren't hazardous materials in the floodplain, loose structures, that there's not vulnerable structure in floodplains. That is not only good flood management, but it is going to protect your infrastructure and services during and after an event. So the flood itself is important, but the community service provided by that infrastructure has a value beyond the flood issue itself. And so it may mean that people who are primarily concerned with education or hospitals or other critical services need to consider climate-related hazards in new ways. And building capacity is a way to address any gaps in knowledge. Enacting plans and policies for adaptation and resilience is at the heart of the plan. And Edith is really the expert who has researched and documented different ways that local governments can evaluate and take action on climate resilience. The enacting part might be some of the easier things that municipalities can do. And we've laid out in the plan really numerous ways to address and begin developing plans and policies. Operations and investments that adapt to future climate change can be at the heart of a lot of different aspects of your local governments. And we have laid out with these objectives a set of strategies that cumulatively support each objective. So here's just a slice of a few strategies that support, say, the engagement and education of the community. And this comes from Edith's research. I should really let her speak here. And Edith, if you want to come off mute, you can. But she's researched plans from around the country and indeed around the world to collate a set of strategies that work at a local level that local governments can immediately pick up and use. And so
just add briefly to what Ned said. So these strategies are sensible, but what was comforting in doing this research, and some of you may have heard me talk about that I approached the adaptation portion of this with some apprehension that we didn't really know how to do this, or that we didn't have the skill set. And what was encouraging is I found these strategies in the plans that we looked at, both that are done locally, other cities around the US, and then globally, we looked at these plans, is that these are strategies that municipalities know how to do very well. Now, granted, it's not all easy, but there are plenty of things. And if you look at the cost and the effort required columns there, these are not expensive or difficult things to do. And so that was what was really encouraging in the set of strategies that we found.
Excellent. So I encourage you to look at the plan because there really are some options laid out. We can get really deep into the weeds on which strategies are going to be most effective. I'm going to move to this slide because it's a nice summary of the type of options, the ways that we think about climate resilience in particular, the things that you can do. You can reduce exposure, but it's expensive and difficult. For example, moving a house out of a floodplain is reducing exposure. Moving people out of buildings and out of floodplains is at the heart of, say, the buyback program that FEMA has. And that does reduce exposure to climate-related hazards. You can also reduce sensitivity by taking high-valued assets out of a floodplain, for example, or out of an area that's susceptible to wildfire, as seen in the image here. Reducing sensitivity involves making sure that there is not a high-valued asset exposed to the climate-related hazard. And that might mean your school or your churches or your city infrastructure, critical facilities, hazardous facilities. Or it may mean that your commercial businesses, your big box stores, either have a margin of safety in their own freeboard, how they construct their buildings, or that they are able to move goods out of the zone of exposure during an event. Adaptive capacity, we've spoken about in terms of that freeboard already numerous times, and that's a great example. Response and recovery is something we come to a lot because local governments deal with emergency management. You have fire departments, police departments, EMS, and so forth. Having an understanding of climate is an important part of response and recovery. But, you know, do your businesses know whether or not they're in a floodplain? Do hotel owners know that they are in a floodplain? Do they know the safest route during an event? The emergency response planning is a very important part of people adapting to the critical time during an event and rebuilding after. So options generally address these four spheres.
Excuse me.
Yes.
I don't think I understand the word freeboard.
Okay. I'll invite Greg to come off mute and talk if you'd like to. The idea is that you have, if you're in a floodplain, there is a flood elevation that you must anticipate. I believe it's probably different in different contexts, but I would need one of you to remind me whether it's a 20 or 100-year flood.
It's the 100-year, Ned.
100-year flood.
event.
So if you're in the 100-year floodplain and you have a building, the flood elevation determines is a baseline, and the building footprint must be 1 foot above that. The foundation must bring the floor level 1 foot above that. Do I have that correct, Greg?
Yes. So that's correct. That's correct. And from a policy standpoint, there's different levels for that freeboard. So that's a great example. So the National Flood Insurance Program, FEMA, says 1 foot is a minimum freeboard. The Kane County Ordinance, which I mentioned was adopted in 2001, set the standard as 2 foot for any building within Kane County, except if you're along the Fox River, it set that freeboard at 3 foot. So you can kind of see without that county ordinance, just relying on the federal standard, kind of that factor of safety. Again, I'll use the term resiliency, or reduced exposure maybe as a, so
I would call that adaptive capacity. Yeah.
Adaptive capacity. Thanks, Ned. I'm learning something new from this presentation as well. So but you can see that there's a minimum standard, and where local policy through ordinance can enhance that to account for that. In my view, it kind of accounts for that potential for the change in the rainfall data. And then it also recognized those facilities in Kane County, which was the Fox River, that is perceived to be more at risk for that change. So anyway, that hopefully defines freeboard better.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Great. So I'm gonna pull a graphic here from the CMAP comprehensive plan, and here's some more options you can develop for dealing with stormwater. Having capacity for infiltration, but notice that these options also build upon one another, because improved park access doesn't just help infiltration of water, it also improves quality of life. And remember the green dotted line I showed you at the beginning of the presentation about resilience. You're trying to enhance quality of life permanently and improve capacity to deal with an extreme event. In this case, this park is providing shade. It's providing open space. It's giving people access for their mental health to get outside, but it's also providing some infiltration capacity, a place for water to flow during a flood, and so forth. So we're looking for the co-benefits and the capacity to increase quality of life with the options that we put into a plan. And that really also factors into how you would prioritize and plan. So CMAP's comprehensive plan again highlights different axes or criteria against which we might weigh options. And so I'm just going to quickly roll through these. The value to a community, the capacity to increase prosperity and jobs, environmental protection, maintaining governance and services, and transportation and mobility. These are important factors in the comprehensive plan, but likewise, you might come up with a whole set of considerations, and climate resilience would be one among those to weigh a potential option for its feasibility and for whether the desirability of funding. And so we've added climate resilience here as a column and a criterion to weigh a potential set of options against one another. And we're looking for those options or combination of options that lead to satisfying multiple criteria. That's a very simple way, but a common way, I will say, for communities to incorporate not just climate resilience, but community resilience into planning and implementation of plans. And implementation is the final step in the steps to resilience, taking action. This also involves, though, monitoring, measuring a baseline so that over time you can say definitively, yes, this improved quality of life. Yes, in the face of a similar event, we saw that recovery was quicker. We saw that people were able to get back to normal life quicker. And sharing your story and iterating is important. I really believe that the leadership Edith and you are taking is important to our nation as a whole. Sharing the success in not just one community, but all of your communities is going to be a beacon for our country. And we need to see you succeed, or as you struggle, learn from what is difficult. So taking action isn't just a one and done kind of a process. We want to learn over time and help other communities come along. So we've set goals in the Climate Action Plan for persistent, equitable climate adaptation. And in the near term, this decade, we want to see governance become climate resilient and equitable. In the future, then, more coordination across jurisdictions. Stormwater management is one of those cases where working across jurisdictions makes a lot of sense. Water flows downhill, and you've got to plan for that eventuality by each city working within the county and so forth to be sure that the infrastructure is up to par with the kinds of challenges you're going to meet. And by mid-century, let's see a comprehensive approach to climate resilience that incorporates our social networks and where people feel seen, heard, understood, included in the resilience planning that we do. At the center of this action plan is a municipal, local focus that recognizes that people, individuals, families, businesses too, are really why we're doing the work. So this is the decisive decade right now. 2021, we're already well into the decisive decade when we're going to determine whether or not we are able to respond to the climate crisis in time. We have to mitigate, we have to adapt now in order to help future generations deal with the impacts of the changing climate. I've saved a little bit of time here before we get to the bottom of the hour to hear some questions, and I'll stop sharing my screen. And I suggest that we open these questions up to Rich and Greg, Edith, and indeed Mayor Burns as well. And to the extent we can make this a discussion, let's do that. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Gardner. Edith, you had mentioned in the chat that one question with respect to how do you strike a balance between mitigation and reducing carbon footprint? And I can't recall who asked the question, but I think it's a pretty good one.
It is a good one. And that was from David Wilms. And I would say if one of the experts that are speaking wants to tackle that, otherwise, I think it's such a broad question that if somebody either wants to comment or put that in the chat, I would just kind of turn that back around to the group. Ned's diagram certainly says that we have to, and you know, as we've said with the CAP, is we have to do both immediately. It's both immediately. It's and I agree that the presentation and that bar chart from Greg and Rich was very powerful to see from an operational standpoint how quickly climate change is upon us. So I'm not going to answer that question, but invite anyone to.
Well, I mean, do you want to be part of the economy of the future? Then yeah, you better mitigate. I think that people want to be part of an economy that's based on renewable energy. I think it's going to be demanded, especially by younger people, frankly. And doing so with doing adaptation work with equity at its center, again, it's not negotiable. We have to do it. So I think it is a both and situation. I think the investments in adaptation, to my mind, is a very logical way to engage this conversation because everyone relates to health and safety, wellness, quality of life. And once you begin that process, you realize, why would I shoot myself in the foot and make it impossible for these adaptation measures to stick and be successful in the long term? I've got to mitigate, and I've got to bring along my state, my region, my nation, and the world. If we are a country that believes in individualism and bottom up, well then by gosh, we better start doing it ourselves. Let's do it. I think this group of people is the group that's going to lead the way. Let's do it.
Unfortunately, I think sometimes getting your balance within your community or your county or wherever it is that you work also involves a budget consideration. And so I think that sometimes is what helps us drive the balance. What is the best we can get? What's the best bang we can get for the money that's available to expend? Because as you mentioned previously, you know, municipalities do have reduced revenue than we may have had, you know, even just 4 years ago. So, you know, I think that definitely has to be considered in the balance.
Fair point. And I'm not pushing back on that. I recognize the rationale personally. It's interesting, though, that people are willing to defray and externalize costs onto, say, the federal government for, say, flood damage. And whenever the federal government recognizes, hey, this is an expense that we're putting on the entire nation for people who are deliberately building in harm's way, I think we have to be willing to call that out and deal with it also.
As
and I think
Martha alluded to.
I think you have to include a price for how much staff is expended to push these how much staff time is expended in talking to residents about these issues. You want to clear that up because you want your staff available to do other things, not to listen to complaining residents who have very good complaints. So I think all of it goes into what the budget is.
Yeah, Rich, chime in. Rich Babica.
Well, as Martha alluded to, though, we, from the operational side, have to find cost-effective means and manners and methodology to make some basic implementations. For example, the city of Geneva for the last 2 years has used warm mix asphalt instead of hot mix asphalt in our road program. It's becoming more readily available. The advantage to the environment is it uses less energy to produce, and it has the same characteristics. It's a little bit more restrictive with the temperatures when you can put it down and apply it. But from a cost perspective, we found it's extremely comparable to our unit prices for hot mix asphalt. There will be a growing trend of electric vehicles for municipal to use. Both Ford, GM, and Dodge are going to have a line of electric pickup trucks coming out that may or may not be available or practical to use for snow removal operations. But especially for a community, even a mid-sized community, it's not uncommon for a truck to go 100 miles during a 12-hour snowplow shift, which is well within the range of a battery pack for an electric vehicle. So that is where I think some of the new technology and new methods and opportunities are coming out from an operational perspective. But we always have to find that balance of, if it's not going to cost us more and do less harm to the environment, that is a sea change that I'm seeing from the operational professional side of public works.
Anyone else? Chime in.
Following the theme of electric vehicles, that's something that costs more upfront but has operational savings. So I think that there's some role for federal and other grants to play in helping push that transition, because we're not going to see the operational savings for some time until we get some more of these vehicles into the fleets.
Good point, Kim. We're past the bewitching hour, so anyone else want to chime in with either a question or a statement? And I'll turn it over to Edith for the ceremonial so long statement.
Actually, Kevin, you do the ceremonial so long statement. I was going to talk about the next Environment Committee meeting. Any last
we appreciate
question?
Everyone being here. And just for the record, ladies and gentlemen, Edith Macro, who is on the screen right now, or should be on the screen, is actually coming from the Shawnee Forest down in southern Illinois. We had to send her away for a while for her own well-being, but we're delighted she was able to join us. So
I'm still recovering from the cap, but yes, I am in the Shawnee. So
I want to know why you didn't bring some others of us to the Shawnee for.
we'll have to do an Environment Committee field trip down here. But this is, I'm in a tree house, literally, outside in a tree house. So it's a wonderful place to connect with everyone here. I do want to thank Dr. Gardiner for joining us, and Rich and Greg and Kevin for all the work that you're doing in Geneva and for sharing. I also want to invite the other communities who are doing this kind of work. Please connect with us and share so that we can all learn from each other. I think this is just such an important part of what we do in the Environment Committee. For the next meeting, we have two possible topics. The next meeting will be November 16th at 10 a.m. To those of you who are new or newish to the committee, we do try for third Tuesday of each month, although sometimes that switches a little bit depending on speakers. But for the most part, you can pencil that third Tuesday out at 10 a.m. And we have two topics. We have yet to figure out which speaker will join us in November and which in December. But we'd like to have a conversation with the RTA planning team. They're working on a strategic plan right now, and we're very interested in the funding allocation process, and particularly in the transportation issues which have emerged as a high priority in the climate action plan. So that's one possible topic, or we'll be working with our colleagues in the New Building Institute and the Midwest Energy Efficiency Alliance, as well as Slipstream, to continue our conversation that we've had about building performance standards and stretch codes. That will be that is another priority that emerged from the CAP, and we'd like to continue to do some work on that. So with that, I will turn it over to Kevin for the ceremonial closing and farewell. So.
Yes, thank you all again very much for your being so generous with your time. I know we've all got a million things to do, and my special thanks to Director Babica and Mr. President, Mr. Chismark, and of course, Dr. Gardiner, and for all of you with the great questions and comments on chat. I am available to anyone, anytime. I think most people have my cell phone, 630-742-8916. And of course, please stay involved and stay in touch. Enjoy your day, enjoy the rest of the week, and you'll hear from us soon via email. Thank you.